All right. Good morning, everyone. I hope you have some energy left on Friday. Today, I'm going to wear not my security hat as I usually do. I'm going to wear my kind of data protection hat. And we're going to talk a little bit about the tough subject, I would say, with the GDPR and how Odoo can help you with GDPR compliance. I'm first going to discuss a little bit the details of GDPR because I think it's difficult to discuss a topic if you don't have a good mental model of a topic. You have to know the key concepts in order to be able to analyze the topic and to take the right decisions. So I'm going to cover all the key concepts. I think as an engineer, not as a lawyer, obviously, I want to show the key concepts that I found important when discussing and preparing for GDPR compliance. So I'm going to describe them as I see them, so that we can then cover the possible options that you have with Odoo to help you with compliance. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, I guess most of you have heard about it. It was not an entirely new body of law. It's mostly an evolution of the existing Data Protection Directive that existed since 95. It doesn't introduce many new concepts. Most of the big keywords like personal data, like data controller, data processor, all of these concepts were already present in the original directive in 95. It just kind of modernizes the directive to make it up to date for current technologies, the ubiquity of the Internet of Things, of mass surveillance. So nothing is really new, and many of the obligations that are in GDPR were already present in different forms in the original directive. So it's really not such a big change, even if it looks scary. There's no reason to panic. It brings a lot of good things for citizens, but even for businesses. It's not a business showstopper, really. It's really good. It brings harmonization, brings centralizations of processes, more rationalization of your processes. It's a good thing. The work that you have to do to assess your compliance is a good thing for an organization generally. Of course, the obligatory disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. I'm going to show you what I think is important about GDPR. You should never take decisions purely based on whatever I say or whatever I write. My advice would be to pick, of course, a lawyer, but pick a good lawyer. I've seen so many wrong assumptions about GDPR and so many bad decisions taken. Obviously, the most striking one is the enormous amount of emails you've received in the few weeks just before May 25th. That was completely madness. It made simply no sense, and I guess many of these rushed emails were probably originating from some legal department, even though they made really very little sense. So, the key concepts that I find very important. In fact, if you want to have a good mental model about GDPR or about any topic, as an engineer, I like to go and read the source code. Here, it would be read the legal text. It's not such a, well, it is very long, but it is not unreadable. It is like a, yes, 90, around close to 90 pages document, but it's very well structured. It's readable. The concepts are laid out in a very logical manner. So You don't have to read all the chapters. Only a few of the chapters are really important for a typical organization. Chapter 1 to 5, a little bit of chapter 8 for the penalties, but mostly chapter 1 to 5 with the definitions, the scoping, the principles, the obligations. And that's a really good way of getting your facts right, rather than based on hearsay or descriptions by other people or reading online resources. There are millions of pages on the internet about GDPR, and most of them are confusing. So yes, that would be my advice. Of course, what is frightening with GDPR is also the penalties. That's one of the reasons why GDPR made such noise compared to the original directive, even though the scope and the content are very similar. It introduces these very important penalties, administrative fees, and that makes a world of difference. It is also a regulation and not a typical EU directive, so that means that it immediately applies to all the European countries. In fact, in the scope, we'll see that it is even larger than that. And that means it's different from the directive that had to be transposed in the domestic law for every single country, so the results were differing depending on where your organization was operating. The penalties are really frightening. We'll see the different concepts in a minute. The penalties are really frightening, up to 20 million or 4% of your global annual turnover of the previous fiscal year, whatever. But if you read the text, actually chapter 8 in this case, you'll see that these penalties are only applicable after checking a lot of criterions. The data protection authorities that have been created in the various EU countries have to follow very strict guidelines in order to determine if there should be if an administrative fee should be applicable, and there are many levels of gravity for a typical violation of the law. You will typically only get a fee after other means have been used. They have received through GDPR the authority to force you to order an organization to change the way they are processing data, to comply before being fined. They can order your business to change the way you are processing data. And that's one of the tools they should use first. Okay, a little bit about the scope. That's the point in Article 2 and 3 of GDPR, the material scope and the territorial scope. The material scope is really important. It means that GDPR applies to close to every data processing activity that anyone will be doing. There are very few exceptions. It doesn't even have to be electronic. It has to be just part of a filing system. There are a few exclusions for personal topics, like something that you would be just doing at home. But otherwise, most of the processing that an organization is doing is covered by the law. And the territorial scope is huge as well. It covers, of course, all organizations that are operating in the EU, but also foreign organizations that are operating with data belonging to EU citizens or activities of EU citizens, even if the organization is not located in the EU. The European Data Protection Board, the EDPB, yes, EDPB, that is made of all the data protection authorities in all the countries of Europe, is currently editing new guidelines on what the territorial scope really means and in what case it is applicable, and of course, how it is going to be enforced, because if Microsoft is liable under GDPR, how are we going to apply that, given that they are a US-based company and so on? The Article 99 basically just says that this is a regulation, so it applies immediately. That's an important part of the scope. It applies to every citizen in the same way in the EU. The roles that are introduced, maybe you know this very well, they're kind of obvious, the controller and the processor. The controller, it's easy, simply whoever owns the data, whoever decides what the data is meant for, how it's going to be processed. And the processor is whoever else is processing the data and that doesn't own it, and usually is processing on behalf of the controller. There are some subtleties like co-controlling cases. Basically, you just have to know which role you are having whenever you process data. You will always be a controller for your own data. As an organization, you have internal data about employees, about customers, about suppliers. You are the controller for that data, obviously. And you may be a processor if you are a service company and you are providing processing services to external customers. Both of these roles are covered under GDPR and carry some obligations. One thing that I find very important is the notion of personal data. It's the same notion, actually, that was in the original directive. The definition is the same. Any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. There are some more explanations. There are many recitals in the law of GDPR. You have more recitals than article where they try to explain the intent of every sentence of every article in the law. I find these three parts of this definition very important. We have any information. Any information means that it's just not your database or whatever is written on paper or in the fields of your database. It can be anything. It can be video recording. It can be even voice recordings. It can be many things, not just the obvious ones. Then we have the last part, an identified or identifiable natural person. This is interesting. It kind of looks natural. You can have a direct link, like the name of a person, their social security number, their private address. Those are direct links. But you can also have indirect links. You can have a knowledge about their habits. You have things like their IP address. You have things like cookies. These are more indirect notions. But as soon as someone, maybe not even you, but as soon as someone can relate them to a person, it becomes personal data. And that's also important versus the relating to part of this definition. Relating to can designate a very tenuous link. One example would be the price of a property, the price of a house. That doesn't look like immediately personal data, but if you can link it to someone, it kind of becomes personal data, not just because of the content of that information, but because of the purpose, the intent, the reach of that information. If you can relate the value of the house of someone to that person, then you can use that to take decisions based on that. You can infer kind of their revenue, you can decide how you are going to treat them, and the intent of that information can have risks, can carry consequences for that person, so that's definitely personal data. You could even have something that's not factual, even subjective data can be personal data. If in your database you have a tag where you put good and bad customers, that's totally subjective, but if you take decisions based on that, it's personal data. It's typically some of the data that the person would want to know about, and they have the right to know about. The processing principles are important. We don't need to go through them in details. The most important, or the one you have to care first about, is the lawfulness, because you have to establish that every processing that you do is lawful. That means you have to find the legal basis for the processing. That's the most important thing. You have to have a clear purpose for that processing, and you have to inform the persons about that processing. So that's really the cornerstone of being compliant. Then you have to limit the purpose. You have to make sure you don't collect things that you shouldn't do, so minimize the amount of data. You have to try your best to keep it accurate. You have to not store it forever. Decide how long you're going to store and why. You have, of course, to take very good security measures, organizational measures to guarantee that you secure it properly. And you have to keep a record, a registry of what you are doing. The legal bases are really, really important. These are the 6 bases, and you have to choose one, at least one for every processing that you are doing. Consent is the hardest one. They're not in order of preference. You shouldn't be choosing them starting with the first one. Consent is actually the hardest one. Is when you have nothing else, then you need consent. And that's the worst case, because consent is really difficult to get. Consent isn't what used to be just a checkbox or some text that you put on the web page hidden somewhere. No, consent has to be now, it's very strict in the law. Explicit, freely given, that means they can opt out. You cannot force them. It has to be informed, so you have to be very clear about what you're consenting to. It has to be specific. You cannot just have a checkbox for 20 different things. And they have to know exactly who is asking for consent and for what purpose. So it's really the hardest thing to do. The other ones are easier and much preferable if you can. The second one, the performance of a contract, as soon as you have some kind of contract with a person, and that processing is based on that contract, that's very strong. That's a very comfortable link to a comfortable basis to use. Legal obligations are kind of obvious. Vital interest doesn't apply to many people, but of course, in life situations where you have to save someone, you don't care about asking for their consent. Public interest doesn't apply to many organizations, just governments. And the 6th one is very interesting as well, is the legitimate interest. It's very important as well. As soon as you have a legitimate interest to do something, you kind of have a good legal basis for doing that. It's not like a free pass. You have to prove that you have a legitimate interest. You have to be able to defend that. You have to balance your interest against the rights of the persons. You have to see if your interest doesn't cause any risk for the person or if it's a very limited risk. So that has to be written down somewhere that you have thought about that. One example would be that whenever visitors are going to your website, you have to record their IP address, you have to record a lot of logs about what's happening. It's not just for free, it's because not just because you like it, it's because you need it for performance reasons, for monitoring your systems, for security reasons, because you have to watch out for security problems. That's actually an obligation under GDPR. So that's a good basis for processing. And then there are these important data subject rights that most of them were already present in the original directive. They are a bit stronger now, and you'll have to know them, and you have to inform your data subject about them, and you have to answer to their questions for that. They're not also free passes. They are subject to many checks, many constraints. You cannot have just someone sending you an email and asking you to delete some random data. They have to prove their identity, and they have to have a legitimate reason for that. That's, for example, the right to erasure, the third one. They have to have a good reason to want to delete the data. And also the data has to be, the legal basis has to be compatible with that. If your legal basis for having the data is a contract, as long as there is a contract, they cannot ask you to delete the data. You have a good basis for having it. The right to rectification is easy. The right to restriction. If they cannot ask you to delete it, they can ask you to stop processing somehow. And that also has to be balanced against your legal basis for processing. And the data portability one, They have to be able to extract the data, so you cannot lock the data in your systems. There are many other requirements that we can't go into all the details, but we have covered the important bases. So, of course, you have to start with making a very detailed data mapping of your processes. That's the cornerstone of your compliance, is establishing your data mapping, your registry of all the processing that you're doing. You have to review contracts, your contracts with your own suppliers, your contracts with your customers, so that some of the details of the law are covered. If you are asking someone to process data on your behalf, you have to be sure that they are going to comply. It's your duty as a data controller to choose only processors that are trustworthy and are going to do whatever you ask to do. And as a provider of services, you have to give the same guarantees to your own customers. So you have to review all your contracts. You may have to designate a data protection officer if you are carrying operations on high-risk data, or if you are mass surveilling persons. There are some cases where it's mandatory even for very small organizations, not always. There's a question of adequacy for foreign data exchange. There's, of course, the data breach notification that is very important. You have to know your obligations, the delay, how you are going to decide if a data breach is risky, if you have to notify the data protection authorities or not, and the data subject then. And sometimes when you are establishing the data mapping, you will have to decide what security measures you're taking. And for that, you may have to carry a data privacy impact assessment, a DPIA. That's the authorities, the EU Protection Board is establishing also guidelines on when really this is required. They initially gave like 9 criterions for very risky operations that should be subject to a data privacy impact assessment, which is basically a risk analysis of the processing and then some mitigation measures that you have taken to versus those risks. So how can Odoo help you with this? Let's get to that part of the talk. Odoo obviously cannot make you compliant. That's impossible because only an organization can be compliant. A software cannot be compliant. There's no provision for that in the law. There will be some certification system that may be put in place, but they will apply to organizations, not to software, because not all of your processing is done in the software. You have many software, you have paper-based processing, you have all sort of processing, so Odoo can't make you compliant. That's very important. But Odoo can help you in various ways, and let's see what are those different things. First, you have to establish your data mapping. Odoo can help you with that. And this is the first thing you have to do so that you know what you are processing, how you are processing. If you don't do that, there's no way you're going to be compliant. You can start, obviously, with Odoo, with your kind of app switcher. You can look at all the applications that you have installed and evaluate your processes by category, by department, if you are a large organization, so that you can start making a full list of all the cases where you are processing or storing personal data. And then you can think of all the related activities with that, all of the possibly sub-processors that are involved in that activity. You can start thinking of the contracts that are related to that activity. You can think of the storage limitations that you want that will be applied. How long are you going to keep the data? When its purpose is finished, or what are all the rules that you are going to follow there? How you are going to handle data subject requests with regard to that piece of data? Are you going to carry out a DPIA assessment for that processing, and so on and so on? So you'll have to start, of course, it's probably already done or close to done, to have this registry, this data mapping, and review it probably with your lawyer, with your legal counsel. This is going to be a very long document with lots of details. This is Yes, it's very, sorry, it's very small. You probably can't read much. It's just to show you, this is the data mapping for Odoo SA. This is only a part of it. It's just the beginning, but you have a list of all the processes, who are the data subject, where the data comes from, what is the purpose, what are the sub-processors that may be involved or not, and then it references another table where we list them, the contracts we have, the contact information, then we have the responsible person, we have, of course, the security measures and organizational measures that apply through for all these processes. That references another table. So it's a lot of work to create that initial data mapping. You have to talk with all the people in the company, and then you have to keep it up to date. So that's the kind of document you'll have. To help with that, for example, the list of processors that you have, you may want to track them. You can do that with Excel spreadsheets, or you can use Odoo. You can create a project for that. It's actually quite easy to do. You create a project, you pick a few stages for that, you put your suppliers there. You can easily attach contracts. You have a life cycle. Whenever you're done with a processor, you archive it, and so on. It's an easy way to manage your processors and be sure that you don't forget anybody. You could do that with just the address book, but it seems like going with a project might be more efficient for tracking the whole life cycle of suppliers. The form view the chatter can keep a history of all the details, links to their own GDPR compliance documents, and so on. Another important thing that you will have to take care of is data subject requests. That's something that you want to organize precisely, because there are legal delays. You have 1 month to answer these requests. Some of the subject may hold you accountable for that delay, so you don't want to get in trouble for a stupid reason like that. You want to set up a process for that. You may want to set up a contact email, like privacy at your email domain, and pipe that into a help desk channel in Odoo, or another project where you are keeping track of these requests. You'll have to establish a workflow where you, as we discussed, where you are going to verify the legitimacy of the request. Then you are going to locate the data in your system. You are going to have to decide how you are going to answer the request. Are you going to grant it? How? Or there's a request for deletion. Am I allowed to delete? Is it legitimate? And am I allowed to delete the data? Or is it going to break my system, my accounting? And should I instead anonymize the data so that I comply with the request? I don't have the personal data anymore, but it doesn't break my system. So there are all these questions that you want to think about. For locating the data, you can start immediately from the contact screen in Odoo, because you have all the links to all the major documents that are in your system. This is important where you have a data access request, where the users are asking you, what kind of data do you have about me? Or you can start with that as well. If you have a deletion request, if you have a data portability request and you need to export it, you can start as well from there and look at all the data that you have to give to the user. You will typically set up, as I was discussing, a help desk project for that. It's convenient because you can put an autoresponder with some initial information. It's an obligation under GDPR to give information to the data subject, even if they're just asking for one of the rights. They have to be kept informed that they have other rights. That's also an obligation in the law. So you can set up autoresponder to say, oh, we're going to take care of your request. We typically take so many days to handle it. We'll get back to you soon. And these are your other rights. Even if you use helpdesk, you can set up an SLA so that you can track if you are late, or if you are going to run late on some of your data subject requests. That's important as well. You want KPIs to make sure that you comply. wouldn't expect that you will get lots of these data subject requests, but actually, we are getting some. We at Odoo, since May 25, we're getting about, let's say, 2, 3, 4, less than 10 requests per week, but that's still a significant amount, even though we have a database with, I think, more than 1 million users. It's still a lot. Many of these requests are automated. People use websites, cloud services that are going to analyze their contact, their emails, and extract all the services that they have subscribed to, and they can just check all the services where they want to send a GDPR request for deletion. So it's kind of often automated. Still, you kind of have to take care of it and make sure you keep track and you don't get too late on answering these requests. You can even set up next activities to remind you. It's not a very time-consuming job if you are properly organized to do that. When you have an export request, a data portability request, you might be tempted to say, oh, we need to automate that. We need to write a complex application that is going to automatically extract, make this zip file with all the data included in it, and that's going to be so important so that we are compliant, like Facebook is doing, and you have a button where you can export your whole life directly as a zip file. I don't think you need to go to these extremities immediately. Given the amount of requests that you are going to get, it's perfectly reasonable and perfectly legal to just process them manually. We haven't received many data portability requests yet. It's even with the number of users we have and customers. Users aren't always looking for that. And often we have the portal access where they can get most of the data already themselves. They can do self-service for that, so that they don't often need to request that. And if they request it, you can choose the format that you are going to return it. It just needs to be some standard format, like a CSV file, so that they can import it in Excel, or a PDF file that they can view. Those formats are okay. So you can use the CSV export of Odoo. You look at all the related documents for a contact, and you export as CSV all the fields. You can probably take all the fields because, as we discussed, even data that is not obviously initially personal data, when you relate it to the person, becomes kind of personal by content or by intent. So we have to kind of probably export everything we know about that person. They have the right to know about that. Or you can use the PDF export. Sometimes it's more convenient if there's just one document. It easily also exports the chatter history of a document. And that's kind of good enough for a data portability request. They have the data, and they can export it, and they can reuse it if they want. And of course, for data correction requests, if you enable the portal, they will be able to correct data themselves. They're going to connect on the portal, change their email, change their address. They can correct some of the data themselves. They can view all the documents that you have about them. Usually that's quite enough for them. The most frequent request you will get, of course, is they want to be left alone in terms of emails. They don't want to be in newsletters, so that's quite okay. They can opt out directly at the bottom of every mass mailing email they get. They can, if they are subscribed to a mailing list or to the forum, using Odoo, the Odoo built-in apps, they can themselves connect and opt out. They can easily do that, so you don't normally need to process these requests. Of course, sometimes they'll just ask you to do it anyway, and you have to do it. Other things that are handled by default is bounce processing. That's kind of an obligation as you are supposed to keep track of the accuracy of your data. So if an email address ceases to function, you should kind of record that and stop emailing them and maybe even delete it. So Odoo records now the bounces whenever you send an email. You can have a bounce counter, and you can decide after so many bounces, I'm going to consider them, it's a dead email, and I'm going to get rid of it. You can also do some anonymization of your data with Odoo. you can, let's say you cannot delete a customer, even though they are requesting it, you cannot delete it because they have invoices in your system, and you don't want to break your accounting data. But still, you have this storage limitation where you're not allowed to keep the data forever. Even if you have you used to have a contract with them, even if you have legal obligation to keep your accounting data available for tax authorities so they can check that you are paying your taxes and that and who are your customers and where they were from and so on. You are obliged to do that. But there's a legal delay. In Belgium, typically you'll have 7 years where you have to keep your data after the accounting entry. But after that, you have no legal obligation to do it, so you have to stop doing that. And if someone asks you to delete the data, you should do that. But you don't want to do the hard deletion in the system. You want to do some anonymizations. That would be a soft deletion. In this case, you can just rename the contact, kind of remove all their personal data, so that the rest of the data used to be what they have bought, what they have done with you, is not possible to relate it to them anymore. The data is anonymized, and that's okay. You have complied with the law. You can do that by editing the contact in Odoo. That's going to propagate to other documents. But then, of course, you need to do some housekeeping with that. For example, invoices are attaching a hard copy of the PDFs to the invoices. You should delete them because there's a printed copy of the name of the person there. You have the chatter history that will record some text that maybe is personal, so you can kind of set up an automated action or server action to do that on a single record to erase the history. That's not going to break your accounting data. One of the hardest things that you may want to do is to obtain consent. And with consent, you want to do it right, so you follow all the requirements of consent. And you want to keep evidence of that consent. So you want, that's something typical, a checkbox on your website somewhere, and you want to record that this user checked the checkbox on that date. We don't do that out of the box in Odoo because there are so many different processes, so many different ways to choose a legal basis for your processing in your case. Often consent is not the best choice. Let me repeat that. So you shouldn't rush and put checkboxes everywhere in your website. Because there are chances your consent is not going to be a real consent, so be very careful with that. But if you actually want to do that, you can do that with a checkbox like this. And because it's not out of the box, it's possible to do it easily with if you have Odoo Studio, for example, and the form builder application. Let me show you maybe if I don't know if I can show that quickly. If I have just 1 minute left. Let's see if we can. No, that's not gonna work. Let me. Where's the mouse? Okay. You can see anything, and I cannot even see my mouse. Okay. Let me switch to. Okay, so that's a quick example of modifying the system. I think I used the CRM. I put in a new checkbox field using Odoo Studio. That's just a few clicks. I hope you can see something. It's very light, very bright. So I'm just dropping a checkbox. Putting some label. Then that's it. We're done with the modification of the CRM. You'll probably need one checkbox for every consent because every consent is specific with a specific purpose. Then I'm going to the website and I'm going to create a contact form, a new page. Then quickly adding a few fields with the form builder so that we can, in this case, I used leads, so we are going to create a lead. Okay. We put a few fields. Maybe I can speed that up. So I'm configuring a few fields. Name, company, I'm just picking them, you see, from the existing fields, because the form builder gives me all the available fields on my CRM leads. Phone, I can choose if they require, notes, okay, message. And then I'm going to pick the new fields that I just created. Newsletter consent, I put it, I change the text, I have to state the purpose, I have to link to my privacy policy where I put all the details of what exactly is the processing and all the other processings that I'm doing. Okay. I put the link to the privacy policy, okay. We can speed that up. Okay, whatever. And that's it. We're kind of done. And whatever people fill in your contact form, the checkbox will only be checked if in the backend, in the database, you're going to have the checkbox checked in your system only if the user has checked it. So you can exclude them whenever you are doing some emailing, and then I just do a test. So basically, I'm filling in, and then we go in the backend, and I can see the new lead that was created, and I can see that the checkbox was checked here, whereas it's not checked by default in other places. Okay?
How are you supposed to track the IP that's checked and the timestamp? Because just the checkbox isn't enough.
It is enough if you have a good face knowledge that you are tracking enough information about that person. You have an email address. You may, if you want to have more check, you may want to set up a process of verifying the email address if you want. That's probably going to be a balance that you have to choose on how much you want to annoy the users versus how sure you want to be about the person's identity. Often you don't have a lot of information about someone except their email, because the rest is just something that they're stating. You cannot verify it. You don't want to ask for an ID card every time. So an IP address, yes, you may want to do that, but it doesn't have a lot of value, and very few organizations will be able to verify that. It's not even guaranteed that by the time you want to check it, the provider is still able to link the IP address to someone. So I'm not sure there's enough value that you want to go into a lot of trouble to record it. But it's like every processing, you have to yourself decide, or with your lawyers decide on the balance of what is the risk, how much trust you want to put in the data of the user, what is the risk, and if you need extra security measures to mitigate it. I kind of lost my presenter view. Okay, no, whatever. But that was, and then there are, Odoo has some good security practices. You can, we have some default systems that are, for example, for securing HR data. We have extra groups that make sure that employees cannot access the personal data of other employees. So there are other tools that you have to know about. We have some of these built-in auditing tools, like you have the chat history. It may or may not be enough depending on the kind of processing you do, but at least it's there. And really, if you're not dealing with sensitive data, you shouldn't be too much worried about the kind of risk. You're doing, most companies are doing businesses with customers, and that's okay. That's a very, there's not a very risky operation. You have maybe like things like the names and contact address and email of your customers. There's not a lot of risk. Even if If someone managed to get access to these emails, what is the worst thing? They will know your customers. They might be able to spam them. There's not a lot of risk. It's not like you're having their medical data or judicial data or more sensitive things like that. When you do, actually, it's time to think much further on what are the security measures that you want to put in place. But most organizations don't need to go into all these lengths. And of course, Odoo is often audited. We have customers commissioning audits, penetration testings. We have our community of researchers watching the source code, analyzing, reporting issues. So that's good. That's something that not many vendors have, an active security community. On the Odoo Cloud, you can, if you want to have some more details, of course, you should go read our privacy policy. You should go read our cloud SLA. There's this page, odoo.com/security, where we give all the details of our security measures. So these are all things that you probably want to check if you are using the Odoo Cloud. We have a contract where we give you the data protection, data processing agreement that you need if you are using us as a processor. And in the future, we're working on new things that we want to add in Odoo, but it's still very early from a GDPR standpoint. There's not a lot of jurisprudence. There's not a lot of existing decisions as to what you should do in what case. There are many areas that are still gray, so it's a bit early to build hard tools that are supposedly supporting cases that are not very really decided yet. But we are thinking of all these improvements, like give optional consent checkboxes that to help you a little bit. You don't have to create them yourself, but we don't want to make this the default because, as I said, consent is not your best legal basis to choose. We'll want to maybe build some tools so that you can analyze your personal data and find it everywhere in your system. Watch out for archived data, because if you click on the links on the form for a contact, you will not see all the archive documents. So you have to make sure you query also the archive documents. If we make a wizard for that, it will take care of that. But of course, we cannot make a generic wizard that will say, okay, this is this kind of request, and I click play, and that's it. The request was handled. No. You have all these decisions that you have to take, or what kind of data, what processing it concerns, what are you going to decide? Should you delete it? Should you anonymize it? Should you not do anything? These are all specific things decisions that cannot be easily taken for you. So it's difficult to make a tool that is not overly complicated, but it's still helpful. So we're trying to look for a middle ground there. I don't know. I don't think I have time for a lot of questions, but maybe you can just join me on the side if you want to discuss extra questions, right? Yes, I should leave the stage for the next presentation, but you can just join me in the back or in the corridor, and we can discuss your questions. Thank you very much.